Okay, welcome everyone to our second day of the BSHP conference and our second keynote. I'm delighted to introduce Saloni de Souza, Dr. Saloni de Souza, who works at Bath University as lecturer in philosophy and ethics. She specializes in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, comparative philosophy, and philosophy of healthcare. And from 2023 to 2024, she was assistant professor at Heinrich Heine University. And from 2019 to 2023, she was associate lecturer and Keeling Research Associate at University College London. And before that, she studied for her DPhil or PhD in philosophy at the University of Oxford, and took an MPhil stud in philosophy at King's College London, and her BA in philosophy and classics here at the University of Cambridge. And the title of her talk is Mixing Up the Medicine, Garcia de Orta on the Problems with Eurocentrism.
So to start with, say thank you to the organisers who have been particularly patient with me, but especially to Leia, with some last-minute health situation things. As you can see, I have this beautiful situation going on, which has given me a bit of a sore throat. So if you can't hear me, just wave at the back, and I'll endeavour to make myself louder. So, unless you're from Portugal or have been very, very born and paid particularly close attention to the Tropical School of Medicine in Lisbon, you've probably never heard of us. And if you've heard of him at all, it's probably because he discovered Asiatic cholera and did some sort of not very approved of dissection in India to do that. In fact, the only reason I found out about him, I'd like to pretend I was doing some research in a library somewhere, but actually I saw a statue of him in a garden in Goa, and it's very unusual to have a non-religious statue, and still more unusual for nobody to really care about it. So you usually see sort of garlands of flowers and offerings, and this one, there was nothing. So I thought, well, that's a bit strange. Let's look this bloke up. So who was he? So Garcia de Orta, 1501 to 1568. He was born in Portugal, educated in Spain, and he initially practiced medicine and lectured in Portugal. The son of parents who had converted from Judaism to Catholicism under duress, so-called New Christians. In 1534, he fled escalating persecution of New Christians. Traveling around Asia, he eventually settled in Portuguese India, so mostly in Goa, and lived there until his death. And while he was there, he carried on to researching, practicing medicine, and he wrote a dialogue. The dialogue is divided into 59 mini conversations, and the first edition had the catchily titled Conversations on the Simple Drugs and Medical Matters of India, and also some of the fruits found there, and in which matters are dealt with concerning medical medicine and other good things to know. Fortunately, somebody obviously told him that that was a terrible name, and it was abbreviated to the Conversations of the Simple Drugs and Medicinal Matters of India. A bit easier to say, but I'm going to call it the colloquial or conversations from here on out. So I put, I didn't realise how small it was, but the first page of the original on the handout. And I should say that I have mostly just used the English on the handout because, first of all, it's in Old Portuguese, which is quite difficult to understand in modern terms. And secondly, it was one of the first books printed using printing press in India, the first in Goa, and the editor was on holiday at the time, and it's full of typos. So I've just used a few sort of key words because otherwise we'll be here all day and nobody's going to be able to make head or tail of it. So this dialogue is full to the brim of details about the natural world. And in fact, although the focus is on India, it's not just about India. The majority of it's about the properties of herbs, spices, plants, animals and their parts, precious stones, and he goes into great detail, for example, about various kinds of cardamom, the bark of various trees, the effects of the environment on peacock meat, opium on different human beings, where you find precious stones, what they look like, how to extract them, and masses about the medical uses of them. Initially, it received a lot of attention, but very quickly fell out of favour, probably a combination of it being plagiarised and where it has received attention, it's generally been seen as a sort of tropical materia medica. And the story there is curious sort of doctor ends up in India, records some stuff about medical substances. If that's right, you can understand why it has philosophical interest. But it's in dialogue form, which is unusual for materia medica at the time. He is constantly engaging with individual philosophers from the Greek, Latin, Arabic traditions, and subtly with Jewish traditions. Also with Jnani and Ayurvedic traditions. And it has, at the very least, sort of subtle philosophical puzzles and ideas. So, for example, thinking about yesterday, the question of the relationship and hierarchy in terms of humans and animals, it has a whole conversation dedicated to the behaviour of elephants, how human-like they are, how they mourn, how they remember their relationships with mahouts. And he seems to think, or at least imply, that elephants pose a problem with that sharp distinction. You've got both African and Indian elephants have this kind of these human cognitive and emotive qualities that make them very closely related. He seems to think that they're quite difficult to sort of place because of those. What I want to show you here, in any case, is that he has these criticisms of the way that Europeans in Europe investigate natural substances. And these criticisms are basically that the way that they investigate it is Eurocentric. But also he shows us some of the problems with trying to escape Eurocentrism ourselves. So let's have a look at the text. It's preceded by Orta's dedication to his patron, the influential Catholic governor of Goa. That's your text one. Wise political move. He would have been viewed with suspicion, even in India. His mother and sisters had already been in trouble. And although Orta was protected in his lifetime, his sister was actually burnt at the stake shortly after his death in Goa. He was posthumously convicted, his remains were exhumed, and the view of him was burnt along with his remains. So, wise political move, Garcia. But it's also noteworthy for its explanation of his decision to write in Portuguese. So, in this text, he explains that he had previously written the whole dialogue in Latin. So that indicates that it's relevant for people who read Latin but don't read Portuguese. So Europeans outside Spain, Portugal, so Portuguese speakers are defined in both Spain and Portugal, or Portuguese. And he chooses to write it in Portuguese because it's more accessible and it's been well received by the people who's tested his ideas in India. Portuguese, that's why he chooses Portuguese. So, whilst his audience is Europeans outside India who read Portuguese, the reader is led to expect material that applies to Europeans generally. Moreover, more important is the dialogue itself. So the beginning of the dialogue, where the agenda gets set for the whole dialogue. I'm going to show that Orta here points to some widespread epistemological failings that are evident not just in Portugal, but in Europe, and in ways that are connected with insularity and superiority. So it opens with the conversation already underway, occurring between the dialogue's main characters, Orta himself, and Ruano, a Spanish doctor who has no historical counterpart. And Orta is asking what Ruano wants to do in Goa. Ruano basically says here, you know, I want to learn about matters relating to indigenous substances, medicinal properties, although, as implied by the original title, his interests actually extend far beyond that. So, why has he travelled all the way to India to find this out? Why couldn't he just learn about it in Spain? And the answer is that Orta believes that, Ruano believes that Orta is a particularly good person to ask. He has both direct experience and the testimony of lots of credible sources who have themselves had direct experience. So he says, seen by you or people of good faith. Partly as a result, they also can report the truth. All these things have to be said in truth. And indeed, he claims some knowledge about such matters in text 2. And if you look at text 3, we've got let alone to the rest of Europe. As he repeatedly emphasizes elsewhere, Orta's the kind of epistemic source that just doesn't exist elsewhere in Europe. So European philosophers who have lived or visited Spain have just been unable to give Ruano the kind of information he wants. So we've got these two Europeans. Both of them are committed to inquiry into matters that lie far beyond Europe through travelling and taking testimony outside of Europe seriously. But it becomes clear very quickly that they are not typical Europeans. And that begins to emerge from a discussion about Ruano's proposed methodology, addressing natural substances in alphabetical order. So, attempting to persuade him, Ruano his initial response begins with text 3. He claims that the only harm that could come to hostile readers is the truth. But notice that the word used to characterize these readings, biting, suggests that they would have significant animosity towards Orta. So they resist accepting what he says, irrespective of truth. Also, these natural philosophers, even those who visit or inhabit these supposed academic centres like Spain, are ignorant of the sorts of things that Orta can teach them. Not just regarding Ruano's interests as specified so far, but the unspecified things that the reader will discover later. So in text 3, Ruano's inquiries have revealed why they're so resistant to the truths that they would impart. We've got, because I have already asked natural philosophers in Spain what they're up to, and they gave me no more reason than that which we all knew there. Now, I think there are a few ways to understand why the answer is supposed to be problematic. I think, given that he uses the idea, he talks about what we know, I think, and doesn't mention sort of educational institutions, we can't be talking about philosophical authority. He's not talking about the fact that they wrongly believe that they already have all the resources to learn about the sorts of things that they were choosing to do. Instead, it seems like he's talking that they believe that these things are things that they're genuinely already widely known in Europe, that they constitute complete knowledge. But in fact, there's more to learn about, namely the sorts of things that David is interested in. Notice that points to an attitude of superiority. it suggests that European natural philosophers in Europe don't need to look outside Europe for complete knowledge. And that's why Ruano promises he's going to restrict his written record of the conversation to just a few people, himself and some of De Orta's followers. So that, I suggest, points to a commonplace epistemological problem amongst European natural philosophers in Europe, which I've called F1 now. Failure to acknowledge that European natural philosophers in Europe don't know everything about the sorts of things De Orta is interested in. Take it that since De Orta, fictional De Orta, doesn't disagree, he agrees. Then we've got related problems in text. So they emerge from reflection on what Ruano says about the minority of Europeans who aren't guilty of F1, namely De Orta's disciples. We've got De Orta's followers who inquired fruitfully and they learned more than him and Ruano in some respects. And it doesn't seem to be just by applying his method, you might think the way you learn in the future. De Orta and Ruano have been focusing on activity, so presumably things like travelling and studying natural diseases, natural substances and disease through direct observation, accredited testimony, recording, reporting. But his disciples have been studying and discussing in Europe, and the very European institutions where those who are guilty of F1 would be working, and where European philosophical authority was central to the educational syllabus and research agenda, notably the classical importance. So what the disciples have learned has arisen by studying and discussing European philosophical critically, and using sources that look or are located outside Europe, particularly De Orta himself, and the sorts of testimony that he's treating as critical. So they're following De Orta, but in a complex way. Again, De Orta doesn't disagree, so I take it that he implies agreement. So De Orta's disciples show that Europeans in Europe can learn about the sorts of things that De Orta is interested in. They also point to maybe how you can do it. But Ruano restricts the people from whom he and De Orta can learn to De Orta's followers, which suggests that very few Europeans in Europe can recognize. I suggest that that indirectly points to two further failures, could obviously underlie and reinforce F1, and which are then connected with insularity, which I call F2 and F3. Relying too much or solely on European philosophical authority in Europe, rather than the sorts of things that I was interested in, seeking out and using credible sources that exist or stem from independent activities outside Europe regarding the sorts of things they also interested in, cumulatively or Now I'm going to look next at text 5. Now this is probably one of the most risky passages in the dialogue. And here, Ruano voices real frustration. The point here seems to be that why is it that there are so many natural philosophers in Europe who are innocent of F1 and F3? Well, some just don't exist in Europe anymore. These new Christians, genuine or nominal, have been murdered or exiled. And notice that the individuals who are picked out here are De Orta's own role models. So these are the best people themselves, so that they're irrationally eliminated, disregarded, or minimized as academic sources. and that all of his role models are identified as evil Christians, hints that maybe their religious tradition might make them better placed to make epistemic progress. So presumably that's their knowledge of Jewish anthropology. Again, it hints at this kind of attitude of superiority. The views of tradition, people who are seen as inferior, other, they just don't belong in Europe. They aren't European at all. So that, I suggest, points to F4, which in turn would make them prone to F3. So we got these failures. The reader expects that to be illuminated in what follows. And I'm going to suggest that one of the ways it's illuminated is through Eurocentrism, although Delta don't use that word. Now it becomes clear very quickly that the sorts of things that it's interested in are primarily natural substances and business. And weirdly, although Luana's initial request was about India, he ends up talking about them in an enormous range. Why? Well, besides being interested in, they also said, well, if you want knowledge about these things, you have to consider geography. And that's for 3 reasons. Firstly, some substances are only found in particular areas. So, for instance, galangal only grows in China and Java, he says. Cloves only grow in 3 of the Maluku Islands. Ruano notes substantive differences between disease in Spain and disease in Gaza. Or if you just look at the detail he gives on where benju is and isn't found in text 6. Secondly, the properties and behavior of natural substances differ according to location. So, coconuts are found in many places, but as you can see in text 7, there are lots of differences. Notably that only specific sorts in long leaves are antidotes, or cholera is more acute in India than in Portugal. One reason why this happens is just that there are different species of things in different places. Another is that the environment affects the properties or behavior of things. So you can see that point being made in text 8, but they also notice a variety of factors, so humidity, temperature, rainfall, distance from the sea, altitude, how close things are, the human habitation, and so on. And that affects all sorts of properties, taste, colour, bark, thickness. And also, he says, the properties of natural substances can change with change of location due to difference in environment, or also due to the transformation itself. Hence, text 9. So this has significance for the way that you should seek and the way that you should weigh testimony. If you want to avoid error, you have to consider both how likely a source is to have directly observed a natural substance or a disease, and where and how far that supports the geographical scope of their claims. But that leads to a problem with the approach in Europe, primarily because their European approach is Eurocentric. So, Orta points out that Europeans had very easy access to Greek, Latin, and Arabic texts. But, and they would also have been central to the educational syllabus at the time. But he says, the Europeans are exceptionally reluctant to question the Romans, especially Galen and the Greeks. And they regard them as sort of indigenous, genuine Europeans. And they identify with them, revere them. And instrumental to that is bias against people whom they regard as different, non-European. For example, people originating in the Middle East who are repeatedly presented by them, the Orta, as being sort of uncivilized and uneducated. And you can see that very well in text 12. At this point, Milano has just talked about Jean Rule. And Jean Rule, at this point, he talked about him as apparently describing Al-Razi and really with a horrible slur in barbaric Mohammedists in dismissing their views. And Rule is presented as this author who's very academically gifted. But in this context, Deontay gives him very sharp reprimand. He says, I wouldn't want you to be so fond of these modern writers who, because they praise the Greeks so much, badmouth the Arabs and a few Moors born in Spain and others from Persia, calling them barbarian Mohammedans, which they hold to be the worst in the world, especially the Italians who are on the side of the group. So, in other words, for Deontay, their bias manifests in elevating their European Greek traditions over the sort of non-European, the Arabic, that's Eurocentric. And so they irrationally give less or no weight to the view from the Arabic tradition and more sole credence to an ancient Greek or Roman model, leading to F2 to F3, and that generates multiple errors. One, and you can see that in text 13, where the bias means that Europeans aren't taking ancients from the Arabic tradition seriously. And interestingly, he cited there not just well-known Muslim scholars, but also a Jewish scholar, Isaac Polkar, who's in the Arabic tradition, Jewish. And, they could likely benefit, a European could likely benefit from them. They're learned, and they're using medicated ones in their locality, so they're familiar. So Eurocentrism is the underlying group. Another kind of Eurocentrism stems in part from Deontay's views about the relevance of geography, in particular their significance for infancy. So even if you know what natural substances there are in one place, you can't infer from that that they all exist everywhere, especially in the environment. Even if you know what properties and behaviour there are as natural substances in one area, you can't assume that they hold it everywhere after quantification or after classification. But he says, well, according to Deontay, ancient authors quite often do that. They quite often make those statements. They neglect important substances, they make errors about the properties of behaviour of natural substances, and recognise changes in substances after long journeys. But interestingly, they also said, well, this is forgivable because ancient authors and the sources they were relying on had limited access to parts of the globe. So he says, long distances make long lives in T14. But with modern Europeans, they hold many of the same beliefs about natural substances and disease, but for inexcusable reasons. So he notes that there are these gifted scholars who are challenging classical authority. There are a few of them. But in T15, he has this specific complaint about Musa and the friars. Despite far easier access to is a credible question, when it comes to natural substances outside Europe, even these kind of high caliber, curious modern scholars, they don't see it. They just parrot claim ancient claims. And that's even the case with sort of things that require very little research, appearance. And I guess that's another kind, I think that's another kind of sense. You assume that it's not necessary to seek testimony from outside Europe, because European authority must be correct. So you are guilty of F3 because of F2, and that leads to X. So another closely connected kind of Eurocentric stems from perfectionism. The point here just the Portuguese have lots of access to most of the globe. So you're easily able to learn about natural substances, different from place to place, and you can do it really easily. You can do it by taste, seeing direct testimony from people who have good grounds to believe, have, unreliable sources, but they don't bother. And the point seems to be that there's just this whole epistemic culture. So everybody, whether they're a sort of scholar or not, is just completely disinterested in learning about natural substances outside Europe, even when it's at their fingertips. That would lead to F3 and F1. And so, for example, Delta says, well, I found this really useful tool, and nobody in Portugal is interested. And he says, well, he does seem to think that the Portuguese are particularly bad. I think that's because he thinks that they have a lot more access. But he also says that this is a problem in Europeans in general. And it's not. It seems to be a sort of asymmetric interest. So, or an asymmetric disinterest. So, for example, it's a disinterest in Asian drugs rather than drugs in general. It's a kind of, the idea seems to be that there's a disinterest in investigating natural substances outside Europe, and that disinterest is far more pronounced when it comes to things outside Europe. So it seems like there's a sort of, the value of natural substances and disease too, the epistemic value, is much less than the epistemic value of natural substances inside Europe. The final kind of ethnicity, final kind of Eurocentrism is that Delta seems to think that you need to have information from people from a certain area in order to get certain kinds of knowledge, because sometimes somebody who's familiar with an area is going to be the person who's best placed to give you information. Sometimes a healer or a physician working in traditions that are tied to their culture is going to be able to pass on ideas that you just don't have access to. But he says, well, European science makes acquiring that impossible. So if you're going to condemn anybody, if you remember the text well, if you're going to condemn them, the Arabic, Moorish, then you're not going to get any of that kind of information. And you also kind of repeatedly show, Delta repeatedly shows that he only acquires certain information by rejecting biases. So in 19, there's a very long passage where Ruano asks a horrible, appeals to a horrible stereotype about the Chinese, and they often and this is absolute nonsense. And later on, he only gets certain information in text 20 by taking the Chinese seriously. So the problem seems to be that Europeans' bias against non-Europeans leads them to irrationally disregard or minimize non-European testimony, such that they don't see it. So it leads to F4 such that they don't seek it, i.e. So I'm just going to end with a couple of what I think is kind of interesting observations about Wilder himself. He has all this stuff about like how terrible the Europeans are. And he goes to great lengths to avoid this in his own work. So Ibn Sena is the scholar he most often talks about. He describes himself as more of a Greek. And he talks about loads of testimony from outside of Europe. He takes lots of people seriously who would not have more ordinarily have been taken seriously, even when it would have actually gotten into quite a lot of trouble. So takes healers seriously, for instance. But he also, for instance, in text 22, says, well, first I default to the kind of medicines of my doctors, and then I go to it. Then I'll go with it. Now I will do it. He always talks about things in terms of Galenic humours and never contemplates the kind of Ayurvedic or Unani alternatives. So he seems prone to F1 to F3 in some contexts. And he sometimes disregards or fails even on European testimony. So the scarcity of African testimony is really striking, particularly since the Portuguese had access to East African testimony. Not only does he have a slave, but he just asks her to fetch and carry, he doesn't ask for anything. He says that yogis are inconsistent and doesn't bother asking them anything on those grounds, but often takes Europeans seriously, even though he says they are inconsistent too. And they seem to be what seems to underlie that is a kind of moral bias. So if you see on text 23 to text 25, he says, you know, of Hindus, of the local Goans, all of them believe in reincarnation, and even besides that, there are 1,000 things worthy of much laughter, which I won't repeat because I'm not going to waste my time. Text 24, many natives in the wild and very little, of people in sort of Mozambique and nearby, there are barbaric people not accustomed to speaking. So we've got this sort of complex opponent of Eurocentrism. On the one hand, he's making this case that the Eurocentrism of various sorts is a major contributor to widespread political failures. On the other hand, he goes to significant lengths to avoid it in his own work, but seems to fail in many respects. And that seems true even though he, I mean, it's difficult to get an explicit sense of this in his own work for understandable historical reasons, even though he himself would have likely been a victim of Eurocentrism. So I think that kind of has an interesting lesson for us too. I take it that it's important to avoid Eurocentrism, whether it be in your approach to understanding nature or other things. But even if you're somebody who's a victim of Eurocentrism, if you're coming at it from a Eurocentric perspective or from a Eurocentric tradition, you've got that problem of avoiding it, even if you're very committed to, even if you're very committed to avoiding it, there are lots of pitfalls in avoiding it. So yes, I hope that we were convinced that he's an interesting person with philosophically interesting things to say. Thank you very much.